Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we give you a very warm welcome to the event Transporting Modeling, for which we have the special participation of Dr. Stefan Hayes, Director of the Choice Modeling Center at the University of Leeds, Dr. Chiara Calastri, Lecturer in Rail Economics at the University of Leeds, Dr. Elisabetta Kerki, Professor at the School of Engineering at Newcastle University. We leave you now with Mr. Julián Arellana, Dean of Engineering at Universidad del Norte. Welcome, Mr. Arellana.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Good morning, everyone. Today, I am very pleased to introduce you to three extraordinary speakers. They are all well-recognized as international experts in the transportation modeling field. But more than that, they are very good friends of Uninorte, but also from the College of Engineering. It is my pleasure to introduce then our three very special guests, Chiara Calastri, Stefan Hess, and Elisabetta Kerki. First, Chiara Calastri is a lecturer in rail economics at the Institute for Transport Studies in the University of Leeds. Her research focuses on the analysis of travel demand, aiming to understand complex behavioral processes and forecast expected outcomes of policy interventions. Her main areas of expertise are choice modeling and econometrics. Particularly, she is an expert on discrete continuous choice models, which are used to understand complex decisions. Also, will be with us, Stefan Hess. I tried to make a short video, but it's quite difficult with all of his expertise. He's an internationally recognized expert in the data-driven study and mathematical modeling of human choice behavior. He has made several contributions to the state-of-the-art in the specification, estimation, and interpretation of such models, as well as in facilitating the transition of ideas and approaches across disciplines, notably by also working in mathematical psychology and behavioral economics. Although a majority of his applied work has been conducted in the field of transport, he's very also active in health and environmental economics. He's professor of choice modeling and director of the Choice Modeling Center at the University of Leeds. He's also a part-time professor of decision modeling, artificial intelligence, and mobility research at Delft University of Technology. He's honorary professor in choice modeling in the Institute for Transport and Logistics Studies at the University of Sydney, and honorary professor of modern behavior in Africa at the University of Cape Town. He's also the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Choice Modeling and the founder of an steering committee, chair of the International Choice Modeling Conference. He is also one of the authors of Apollo, which is a powerful free tool for estimating and applying choice models. Our third guest lecturer will be Elisabetta Kerki, who is a professor of transport at University of Newcastle. She is an adjunct professor at the School of Economics and Management in the Beijing Jiantong University in China. Her area of expertise are discrete choice analysis, decision-making processes, bounded rationality, data collection, mode choice, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles. She is the editor-in-chief of the Transportation Research Part A journal, and she is part also of the editorial board of at least 6 of the most important journals in the transportation field. She is also part of the steering committee of the European Association for Research in Transportation and the International Conference on Transport Survey Methods. We will start our event with the presentation of Chiara Calastri. She's going to talk about multitasking while traveling using discrete continuous choice modeling. Chiara, welcome to your presentation.
Hi, hello everybody, and thanks very much, Julian, for a nice introduction and for inviting me to speak. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. Right. Can you see it properly?
Perfect.
Perfect. Great. So as Julian said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent work that I've done, and some of this is still in process, about multitasking while traveling. I'll talk about models and data challenges around this topic. In particular, I will give a short introduction about what is travel-based multitasking and why we study it. I will talk about two papers. One is completed and one is in progress, and a little bit about where this field is going, why it matters, and what's needed to develop it further. So what I want to start with is that the issue of travel time has always been kind of traditionally seen as the time spent traveling is time wasted. So we need to do what we can to reduce it. But this is not always the case, in the sense that, especially with passive modes, such as public transport or traveling as a passenger, we know that people do stuff. They keep busy while they travel. They socialize, they read, they work. And there's studies showing that they do a range of different activities. Even if you think about when you travel by car, when you drive, you're still likely to listen to the radio or to make phone calls. So this time is often not entirely wasted. There is a growing literature in this area. And as I said, it is a key topic for valuation. So people are trying to understand whether the fact that people are doing something while traveling can affect their value of travel time, so they can feel like it's not so bad if the travel is a little bit longer. In particular, there's different studies looking at different case studies, different countries. And one key theme here is the one of connectivity. That is the idea that if people have a good internet connection and can do activities, maybe this affects the value of time. So the key questions in this literature, which is still relatively young, so there's still a lot of work to do, are around what are the type of trips and what are the modes that are associated with multitasking, and also who and what activities, so who multitask while they travel, what activities do they do, and for how long. In addition, there's this issue that I've already introduced about whether the ability to multitask impacts the value of time, and whether policy should facilitate multitasking. So you have to excuse me for 1 second because I thought I was giving the second presentation. So I have a dog barking in the room. I just need to get rid of her. Give me 1 minute. These are the key questions. Maybe my absence has given you time to read them and reflect on them. And so how do we answer these questions? We collect data, as in most of these kind of studies. Then we produce statistical models that try to represent what is happening, try to understand this kind of behavior. And then we use the results of this model to formulate policy interventions, depending on the results. So the first paper that I want to present today is focused on online activities while traveling, in particular on whether people, while traveling by train specifically, conduct online activities and for how long. This type of study, we've done it by using a survey that has been administered on the train in Travelers in Scotland for a specific 1-hour journey. And we apply a model which is called a multiple discrete continuous model, developed by Chandra Bhatt in 2008. So I should say, because I know that today we have a bit of a mixed audience and not all of you will be familiar with econometric models, that the whole idea behind a discrete continuous model is that it's a model that allows us to represent multiple type of choices that have both a discrete and a continuous dimension. So think about when you go to the supermarket and you choose which items to buy and how much of each. You get apples and you get pears. How much do you get of each? If we want to represent this kind of behavior when people choose multiple things and a certain quantity, we use a discrete continuous model. And this is used for mainly in time use, as we do here. So we say, while people travel, they do a certain number of activities, and we want to know which activities and for how long. Then we use the results of this model and we translate them in policy terms via the Hencher equation. And I'll tell you a little bit about this in a moment. So what kind of results do we get out of this type of model? We understand behavior fundamentally. We learn that younger passengers are more likely to engage in online leisure activities, that first-class travelers tend to work or relax online rather than kind of staying offline. And we know that, for example, depending on the purpose, so if people travel for commuting or business or education, they are more likely to work online. And they do the same in the morning peak. And while if they travel with others, they stay offline. So this confirms the kind of intuition that if you're traveling maybe with a friend or with a family member, you're not going to do online activities. So, sorry, this way. So I've told you earlier that these results can be translated into policy kind of ideas and conclusions. And the Hencher equation is a known tool in transport economics that basically links the value of business travel time savings to a number of considerations about travel time use and productivity. So the idea here is that this Hencher equation I haven't shown you is a big equation, but there is a parameter P star that represents the proportion of business travel time saved that would have been spent working. So this is a bit of a convoluted concept, but it's the idea that if you have a 1 hour business trip, for example, and you save 20 minutes because let's say there is an improvement of the network, then the question is what percentage of those 20 minutes would you have spent working? And this is obviously an important measure because we want to know whether the time saved, could have been used productively or not. And this kind of model and the forecasting results allows us to establish what are the bounds of this P parameter in certain scenarios. So for example, if everybody uses a laptop or a tablet, does that measure change? And obviously we could do this also, potentially if there's an improvement in infrastructure. So if the train company puts better connectivity or tables everywhere, would this proportion change? So this is a type of results that we can get out of this model. So this is kind of first piece of work. And the second piece of work instead that I want to talk about has to do with time budgets. So this is still a modeling concept of how we model multitasking, but I want to try to explain it in a kind of, hopefully in a simple way. So I've told you before that we use this multiple discrete continuous model. And I've told you what kind of choices we can model. And this model generally relies on a budget. So in my example about going to the shop, you can choose how many items to buy and how much, depending on how much money you've got in your wallet. Or if you decide which car to drive and how far, depends on how much fuel you've got and so on. So when we're talking about time, a lot of time discrete continuous models are organized within a day. So they have a time budget of 24 hours. And what we study is how the time is allocated within those 24 hours. So you could represent it in a pie chart like this one. But if we assume that people can multitask, so that each unit of time can be used for multiple activities, then the pie chart looks more like this. It looks layered because in each kind of slice of that time, you could do multiple activities. And so things get a bit more complicated and you wonder if the budget assumption that we use in these models is adequate or not. So what we use to try to understand this, we use the UK time use study 2014-2015. So basically in this study, a lot of people are asked to complete 2 24 hours activity diaries. And I've put here an example of what a 24-hour, well, this is kind of a daily activity diary looks like. So you're asked to identify what are you doing at each time in those 24 hours, and also if you're doing multiple things at the same time. People report a primary activity and also a number of secondary activities. So we focus on, obviously, on travel. So we don't look at, when you're having breakfast at home in the morning, but we only take those observations of when people travel, and we look at what other activities they're doing while they're traveling. And we group them in a number of categories, as I show here. So there is work and education, there's social activities, personal care, such as eating or sleeping, mass media, hobbies, and household care, such as taking care of or escorting children. So we get this data, and what we do, we say, okay, if we want to use an MDCV model, the model that I've told you about earlier, we need to establish a budget, which normally would be the trip duration. So you travel for an hour, let's say, we try to understand what you do within that hour. But let's say that the diary data corresponds to what I'm showing up here. So we see that during this trip, if we split it in 10 intervals, we can see that in each of these intervals, you do one activity, or you do 2 or 3 or even 4. Okay, this is an example. When we estimate our MDCV model with a budget assumption, we can't accommodate all these overlapping of activities, and we have to somehow select what is the main activity. And this, we can do it in many ways. We can look at what the person has reported. We can decide, for example, that works matters more than hobbies, and so on. We need to make up rules. So what we do in this work to decide whether the budget is a good idea or not, first of all, we try to estimate different MDCV models with different assumptions. So what is the most important activity? And what we find in terms of marginal effects, so the results, is that this doesn't make much of a difference. So this is kind of reassuring, because there's a lot of studies out there that decide how to organize the data. And we find that at least with this, kind of large data set, it doesn't make much of a difference. So then we try 2 other things. First, we use still the MDCV model, doubling the budget. So we say, if we assume that people have double the duration of time than the trip, this is completely arbitrary, what happens to the results? And then we use a new model, which is being developed by David Palma, my co-author on this paper, and Stefan Hess, who you'll hear from in the next presentation, where basically there's no budget to assume. So this model assumes that there's an infinite budget. And what we find is that in this case, we get more similar results between the model without a budget at all and with a very large, increase in having a 200% of the budget. So what this tells us is that these different models have strengths and weaknesses. The traditional MDCV model used for time use, you need to define a budget constraint. You have to make that assumption. While this new EMDC model allows the flexibility of not imposing a budget and letting the model allocate, explain the time allocation. But at the same time, the traditional MDCV, when you do prediction, you predict a reasonable time allocation, while with the model without a budget, sometimes the prediction overshoots. So this model will predict that within a 1-hour trip, you do work for 1 hour and 10 minutes, which is something due to the fact that the model doesn't have a budget. Another kind of con of the traditional MDCV is that you can't get specific results that relate to multitasking, so which activities are done at the same time, because it doesn't allow it. While with the new EMDC, you can get insights into complementarity and substitution. And I'll show you an example of this now. So what kind of results do we get from this EMDC model? I'm just giving you an idea of the results from this final budgetless model. We find, for example, that if trip duration increases, people are more likely to engage in any activity and spend more time. So these results I'm presenting here, they are marginal effects. So basically they show the changes in the activity engagement and in the time spent when something else in the model changes. So in this case, we assume that the trip duration increases by a certain percentage, and we see that people are more likely to do something and to spend more time with respect to when the trip is the original duration. We also find in terms of mode that multitasking is least likely on a bus. We use car passenger as a base, but we see that it's less likely than any other mode. We also find that hobby activity, mass media, household cares are more likely on a train, and the work is the only activity that you're more likely to carry out on a coach rather than as a car passenger. So these results tell us a little bit a connection between the mode and what people do while they travel. We get some results in terms of purpose, though these are arguably less interesting because they're less, you can do less in terms of policy. We find that work activity, hobbies, and mass media are more likely on commute or business trips. And mass media is also likely on shopping trips. So in shopping trips, you're more likely to listen to the radio or watch a video. And social activities are more likely on trips for education, but less on work trip and for less time. So what you see from here is that we get insights both in terms of which activities people do and how long they spend. We got more results in terms of social demographics and interactions, which I don't have time to present here, but we also get insights into complementarity and substitution. So for example, we learned from this model that social activities such as chatting with a friend and mass media, such as listening to the radio or watching a film, are less likely to be performed jointly while traveling by train. And we get other similar results like these. So I've told you a little bit about the models. I've told you what kind of results we get in. So where does this leave us in terms of this field of analysis? So one important thing to notice is that the data and the models are traveling at different speeds. The work on multitasking uses advanced discrete choice models, the MDCV framework or copula approaches, which are basically increasingly complex models that require large data sets and data sets containing a lot of information. But at the same time, we don't have this data. The data is collected with small ad hoc surveys or with travel surveys that maybe gather limited information, because, for example, the one we've used, it's a time use survey. It's not a time use while traveling survey. So it won't have a lot of information that would be important. For example, whether there's Wi-Fi or tables on the mode of transport. Or this data collected with qualitative observation. So there's a person on the mode of transport looking at what people do. All this data, this means it's kind of limited in information, it's small samples, and it's very rarely open access. So this means that we really need to develop new data collection methods, which are more accurate but are sustainable. They're not asking too much of respondents, but without better data, there is no point in developing more and more advanced models to understand multitasking, at least, I believe. We need to learn to translate this complex model results into useful policy indicators. And also we need to make it more common to incorporate multitasking in value of time study, and not just value of time, but value of other things such as comfort or connectivity, as well as productivity and work time definition. There's a lot of discussion on whether, what do you count as work time? Is the work that you do on a train counting towards your working hours? And if we don't understand what really happens, we can't enter those discussions in an informed manner. And finally, I think this area is getting more and more important in terms of the new emerging modes. So think of autonomous vehicles, which are vehicles where you will be able to use the travel time productively or for fun. So how much does it matter that autonomous vehicles are fast? Do we want to save time, or do we want to provide a comfortable environment for multitasking to occur? So I hope I've given you a bit of an overview into this area of research. Thanks for listening, and here's my email if you have any questions later on.
Thanks, Chiara, for your interesting presentation. At the end of all presentation, we will open a space for question and answers from the audience. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Stefan Hess. He's going to talk about innovative data sources and methods to estimate value of time for transportation projects. Stefan, welcome to Cátedra Europa.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Just share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so this is really the work of one of our PhD students, Panos Soloridis, and who is in the audience as well today. And he's volunteered to answer the questions as well, I think. But it's part of a long-standing body of work that we're doing in Leeds, looking at alternative data sources. And it's also linked to work that's very much at the heart of my interests, which is to try and move away from hypothetical data when we can for doing transport appraisal. So what I'm looking at in this presentation is the value of travel time. So VTT, which is often seen as the most important number of transport economics, it's a key input to cost-benefit analysis. So what it relates to is the monetary valuation of changes in travel time. Many people talk about value of travel time savings. I try and avoid that term because it's not all going to be just savings. So some journeys will become longer, some journeys will become shorter. These values, as I said, are a major input to cost-benefit analysis, and as a result, the accuracy of these valuations is of great importance. Since the 1970s, with some exceptions such as business travel, so Chiara mentioned the Henshaw formula, but since the 1970s, value of travel time measures have been routinely obtained as an output from discrete choice models based on random utility theory. So these are mathematical structures that seek to explain human decision-making using transport and many other fields. And a major question, of course, in this context is what is the data that we use to estimate these models on? So if we want to understand how much do people respond to changes in travel time, changes in travel cost, and so on, we need to estimate our models on data that looks at travel scenarios. If you're looking back to early work on value of travel time, going back to the 1970s, that work was looking at revealed preference data. So when I talk about revealed preference data, these are real journeys made by real people spending real money in real time. So the emphasis here is on real data. But in the 1970s and going as far as the late 1990s, the opportunities in this context were very limited, with revealed preference data often just including a single journey per traveler, and often also relying on respondent recall. So where you would ask a traveler, what is the journey you made? How long did it take? How much did it cost, etc. That creates a lot of scope for error. In addition, in many countries, there was a perceived lack of real-world situations where travelers make time-money trade-offs. So not many toll roads, and mainly the situation where public transport does not give people a choice between a fast, expensive and a slow, cheap option. A lot of this is actually due to a reliance on within mode settings as opposed to between mode choice, which I'll get back to later on. So all of this led to a increasing shift towards data preference data. So since the 1980s, much of the value of travel time research has made use of data preference work, and especially in the form of data choice. So I've got two examples on the right-hand side here of my slide, where respondents in these surveys are faced with a number of scenarios, each time involving trade-offs between key attributes, and they're asked to choose the option that they like the most. To try and make these scenarios more realistic, because these are hypothetical choices, they're not real journeys people are making, the scenarios often pivoted around the real-world journey, so to try and make them realistic and for the respondent to be able to relate to them. There are major differences across countries in the level of complexity used. So at the top here, I've got a typical Australian approach, which typically uses 3 options with 5 or 6 attributes. Bottom, I've got the typical UK approach, which is very simplistic, simple time-money trade-off. Now, this shift from RP towards SP was primarily motivated by a lack of suitable RP data, limitations of RP data in terms of measurement error, and also a lower cost of the RP data. The problem is since then, SP has become kind of the status quo, And new value of time studies don't even really think about, should we be using RP data, should we be using SP data? There's an automatic move towards SP to just repeat what we've been doing before. The problem is SP, while many people might see it as the obvious answer, is also not free of issues. So stated preference data, because they're not real choices, is prone to hypothetical bias, but also strategic bias, where the respondent might answer the questions in such a way to try and influence the outcome of the study. And this is to the point where in some parts of economics, some journals, it's impossible to publish work using stated preference data. The other problem is that stated preference data has the flexibility that the analyst designs the survey and thus can decide what questions are being asked. But that, as a result, might mean, again, that the results also depend on the decisions made by the analyst. What are the scenarios that people are being faced with? And while we try and make these scenarios realistic by framing them around a real-world journey, often we're framing the scenarios around just a single real-world journey, which means that for a single traveler, the scenarios are pretty homogeneous. So one person might get lots of short journeys, another person might get lots of long journeys, and that makes it impossible to disentangle within and between traveler effects. But the real issue here for me is that revealed preference data is the truth. That's real data. And we should keep exploring options to find suitable new data sources to estimate value of travel time measures. Now, obviously, what's happened in travel behavior research over the last few years is the emergence of ever more opportunities of data sources, passively collected data sources. So using sensors and various other mechanisms, mobile phone data, and so on. The advantage is that there's less respondent fatigue than with travel diaries because the data is collected automatically. We get very large amounts of data very cheaply and a very high spatial temporal resolution. The problem is that the data might not be representative of the whole population, but most importantly, the key issue is that you will have missing socio-demographic information, so that we can get this data from road sensors or even mobile phone companies, but we do not know anything about the traveler that's making the journeys. And that's an issue when you try and compute value of travel time measures that are representative. So what's the aim of the work I'm presenting here? The aim here is to establish whether revealed preference data from these new emerging data sources can be used to compute value of travel time measures that are similar to the official WebTag. So WebTag is the web-based travel guidance in the UK. The official measures in that which come from SP data. And my aim here is not to show that RP can work, but to really show that, well, if RP can produce reliable results, then maybe we should just be starting with RP in the first place instead of looking at SP. Purely passive RP data sources can be difficult to work with, even though another one of our former students, Andrew Mampali, was using mobile phone data and computing value of travel time results. The problem is you then don't have the social demographics to link the results to. So what Panos did in his work is looking at semi-passive data sources. So data that is still automatically collected, but where there is some user input to enrich the data. So this was a large project we had in Leeds called Decisions, so funded by the European Research Council. And as part of that, we conducted a traditional household survey, where in addition, people were given a smartphone app on their phone for 2 weeks that was tracking their activities and tracking their travel patterns, mostly around Yorkshire and specifically in Leeds. So the way this looks is the little pictures on the right-hand side here. The mobile phone, if you're carrying it with you, realizes that you're moving. It realizes a start point and an end point. And then when you come to the end of your journey, it will ask you some questions. It will ask you, well, what mode of transport did you use? Why did you go to this destination? Who did you travel with? And so on. And over time, the app learns so that, if you keep going to work the same time each day, it doesn't keep asking you each day, how are you getting there? Why are you going there? And so on. So a large data set, 540 individuals making over 12,500 different trips across the 2-week period. Now, so what this data set involved a lot of processing. So used identified unique activity locations, and then identified homework locations, and then assigned the trips into daily tours, so that you have you're leaving home and you're going back to home at the end of the day. And the focus here in the study is on mode choice. Now, mode choice has traditionally been avoided in value of travel time work. And the argument tends to have been that if you're looking at mode choice, you might be confounding travel time sensitivities with modal preferences. But if you're actually doing your modeling carefully, you can avoid those issues. And in that case, mode choice actually becomes the most obvious option in the case of these emerging data sources, because you're seeing people making journeys by specific modes. That means the other modes, they're not being used, and you can understand that mode choice on the basis of sensitivities to travel time and travel cost. Now, the data, of course, because the mobile phone tracked people, so we knew where they went, at what time and how long it took. But obviously, the phone only tracks the journey that you make and not the alternative journeys that you could have made. So we have no information on the travel times and costs for, well, we have information on travel time for the chosen mode, but not for the unchosen mode, and no information on costs for chosen or unchosen modes. So Panos spent a huge amount of time using Google API to compute the travel times for the different modes of transport, imputing the travel costs using formula in the case of car, and then for bus rail using timetables and cost tables, and for taxi, similarly looking at a combination of fixed distance and time costs around Yorkshire. So a lot of enrichment of the data that needs to happen in this case prior to the analysis. Now, the important point is that whenever you do a value of travel time study, the data that you're using is just a sample of trips. And of course, if you're wanting to produce results that you're going to be using in travel appraisal, transport appraisal, you need to expand those results beyond just the estimation sample to a regional or a national level. So in this case, the data that was used for that is the National Travel Survey, which contains data from just under 30,000 individuals making over 450,000 trips. And again, that data needed to be enriched for the unchosen modes in terms of, again, travel times and travel costs. So if you're comparing what the original study, so the last national study in the UK did for value of travel time, so this was 2014-2015, this used SP data with over 7,500 individuals, and then again used the NTS data for expanding the data to a national level, and then distance weighting based using an estimated income model, whereas the study here now uses this GPS data with a smaller number of people, but tracked over a period of 2 weeks, which means that people make short and long trips. A more recent national travel national travel survey, and then using data from the census for the distance weighting. The modeling work made use of two different structures. So started off with a multi-neighbor logit model, but including deterministic heterogeneity, so explaining the role of income, for example, insensitivities, journey purpose, and so on. And then moving towards mixed logit models, where the mixed logit models captured, in addition to the deterministic heterogeneity, captured random heterogeneity, so variations in the travel time, travel cost sensitivity, and so on, that could not be explained on the basis of things that we observe about the travelers. And for that, Panos used log uniformly distributed parameters, the same way that the most recent national study in the UK had done. So the idea here is very much that the modeling approach is pretty consistent with the most recent national study that was based on set of preference data. So if we're looking at the results from the MNL and the mixed logit model gives us substantial improvements over the MNL model, and also increase in the level of service parameter scale, so the elasticities are higher in the mixed logit model. I'll talk in more detail about the results in a minute. So this is just showing you the contrast between the two model structures. The rho squared measures are very high, and that's what you see with mode choice in situations where there are many cases where one mode is going to be a lot better. So then, after estimating the model on the GPS data, came the stage of expanding it to the National Travel Survey. So using sample enumeration for the chosen mode, so calculate the value of travel times for the different modes, and for commuting, business, and other non-work trips as other purposes. And then used distance weighting based on the census data. So reweighting trips by looking at, what is the share of trips of given distance bands, purpose, and mode in the census data, compared to the NTS data. And finally, computed standard errors using 2,000 draws in simulation. And then what we can do now at the bottom here, we can compute a t-stat for the difference between the GPS results. So these are the value of travel times from our study and the value of travel times from the SP study, so the official values currently being used by the UK government, the UK Department of Transport. And then obviously dividing at the bottom here by the standard deviation. So what I've got on this slide here is comparing the GPS results, so that's the first column, with the official values. And the reason I'm putting this message in red here is that the work on the GPS data is much more transparent. There's a lot of processing that goes on the data, but then the actual modeling work uses real data, gives you results that you can use. Whereas with the SP data, what you're seeing is that you're finding many SP artifacts, people choosing the option on the left more often than on the right. You need to correct for that. People having reference dependence, asymmetries, and so on. So there are many artifacts happening in SP data where these results shown in the second column, which are the official results put forward in the guidance by the UK government, are partly a result of, shall we say, ad hoc decisions made in terms of which are real artifacts and which are SP artifacts. Now, the reassuring thing here is that the results coming out of the GPS study are not different from the ones from the SP data. So this shows us that we can use GPS data to compute value of travel time measures that are in line with currently accepted values. The only difference being the value for commuting by bus, and where you can see that there the value from our study is higher than the official value. And I think here the order makes more sense in our study than the official study, so that commuters have a higher value of travel time on bus than other purposes. You can also then look at segmenting the value of travel time by distance, and that's where we're seeing larger differences across the distance bands than in the official study. So a bigger increase on the value of time on longer distances than is the case in the SP data. And I think this makes inherent sense that in the SP data, it's far more difficult for respondents to relate to differences across journeys in terms of time between longer journeys and shorter journeys, but also going back to my earlier point about the within people differences and between people differences that arise. So conclusions, what we find here is that the overall results that we're getting are similar between our study and the official results, but using a much smaller sample, and most importantly for me, without the corrections that you need to make for SP effects that are inherent to all these studies based on SP data. We see bigger differences when segmenting the value of travel time by distance, which is a key thing to be doing in policy work. And an important point here is that the smaller GPS sample can really be used as an argument to conduct these studies more frequently. So the most recent UK value of travel time study, national study, the data was collected in 2014. The one before that, the data was collected in 1994. So they waited 20 years, okay? And whereas if you're doing this with GPS, you can do much more frequent refresh of the data and update your model results in consequence. And then obviously our argument here is that we can produce reliable results without the risk of hypothetical bias or impacts of the survey design, because that's the other thing, is that the question is, any of these studies using SP data, how much are the results influenced by the decisions made by the analyst in terms of which attributes to include, what presentation method to include, and so on. Okay, and then very helpfully, the last slide for questions has Panos' email address rather than mine, but I'll of course also be here still to answer questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Stefan, for your interesting presentation. We are going to move to our last but not least speaker, that is Elisabetta Kerki. Elisabetta is going to talk about challenges and new methods to understand and forecast travel behavior. Elisabetta, welcome to Cátedra Europa.
Muchas gracias. I will speak in English. Can you see my slides?
Okay.
I share the slides, and now this is in. Did you see the presentation mode or?
Yeah, if you can hide the bar at the bottom of
With this one?
the screen. Yeah.
Okay.
Not hide. Yeah.
Okay. So you see the presentation mode. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So just a second, organize myself. Okay. So first of all, yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure. Well, you said already what I'm going to talk about, which is the challenging when we want to try to estimate demands for innovative transport systems. And I'm going to talk today about autonomous vehicles. There are many different technologies nowadays, many different innovation. So even if I'm going to talk about autonomous vehicles, the problem is for any kind of innovation that are emerging and will be even more present, of course, in our life in the future. And we know that governments worldwide, they are investing lots of efforts and money in these technologies, try to foster the development. So it is definitely critical to try to understand when we will see this technology in our real life, because at the moment they are not there. Some of these technology are present, but definitely not at the level that we would like to be present. This is an example of MAS. We had a seminar today from Professor David Enscher. He said that most of the practical example of MAS have not been as successful as was anticipated. So even something like MAS that might seems to be easier to implement in reality when we talk about technology and innovation, there might be surprise in how people adopt and use the technology. Understanding the demand for transport is very, very complex. We had examples from also the previous presenters. There are so many effects that impact the demand. And some, of course, are typical, the alternative we have available, but we also have many other effects that everybody around us affect what we do, our past experience, future expectation, everything affects the way we move. And when on top of that, we also put innovation, technology that people do not know, and also there is uncertainty because what we have today is probably going to change in a couple of years because technology are advancing fast. So all this, of course, makes the prediction or try to understand what will be the future of this, the demand for this technology, even more complicated. So I'm just briefly today highlighting two aspects. One is the social dimension impact on the demand for innovation, and the other one is the user preference, how to compute them, how to estimate them when the technology is not available. So this is a comparison in terms of social dimension. If a good comparison with autonomous vehicle is the case of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles started entered the market 10 years ago or something, for maybe even more. So people at that time, a researcher immediately started trying to forecast the demand for electric vehicles. And all the forecasts had this kind of shape that you can see here. So it's basically exponential shape. And these studies are based on the study of the diffusion of innovation, the work that Roger did in 1962, and basically is the way innovation diffuse through communication among people. And it's a communication, of course, about new ideas, how they communicate new ideas and exchange idea between people. And so you can accept and adopt the idea of the person you're talking to, or you can reject and do not adopt the innovation. And this is the base. There are models, of course, mathematical models. The first one is back in 1969. And then nowadays, of course, there are lots of advances in this model of diffusion. But the basic idea is that there are some people who adopted technology earlier, even if they don't have perfect knowledge, etc. So they are the innovators. And then there are people who follow up, so the imitators. And this is also the kind of models that even now we are using to try to forecast, for example, the adoption of autonomous vehicles. Of that, there are limitations in this kind of models. And the first is that they do not consider that there might be substitution in, some alternative that people might choose instead of the autonomous vehicles. There are lots of aspects that might increase the diffusion or reduce the diffusion. It can be, for example, incentives that lots of governments are giving, or a barrier that might reduce the diffusion of this technology. There is a big problem in terms of how to compute this coefficient of innovation. Typically, we use, or those who have done this study, they use the coefficient, the rate of innovation and imitation from all the studies. So, for example, the same methodology has been used to study the diffusion of, I don't know, the cell phone or the refrigerator, all this kind of innovation that for us is not innovative anymore, but at that time they were. So we try to use the same coefficient also to study, for example, the innovation of autonomous vehicle. But of course, this is not exactly the same. So there are lots of there can be bias when we use this coefficient for different type of technology. And this model in particular, they are a very aggregate model, and they assume that the entire society is fully connected. So everybody can basically communicate with everybody, which is not the case. We communicate more with those who are around us, our colleagues or neighborhood or family, etc. So all this is not taken into account in this model. So the research, the work we are doing, various colleagues are doing in this field is, for example, to integrate either diffusion models with a substitution model that covers some of these aspects. For example, we can estimate the coefficient of the preference for characteristics of the alternatives. The model are more disaggregated rather than aggregated. So these are typical substitution effect. Or on top of that, there are colleagues who are trying to integrating also agent-based model. These are fully disaggregated model, and in particular allowed to take into account social interaction at individual level. So the research direction in this field is going towards what is called mixed method, which is a combination of all these methods and trying to take the best of each one in order to try to incorporate properly all the effects that impacted the adoption, so we can hopefully have a better forecast. The problem, even in this mixed method, however, is that still the coefficient, even if we are able to estimate the coefficient with the substitution method, still this method are valid when the market is stable. And when it comes with innovation, the market is absolutely unstable because the innovation are developing. So we don't know what exactly will be the innovation tomorrow. So it's very difficult to calculate. Even if we can calculate now, it might be that as the market change, this value will be different. So if we look at how we do calculate this coefficient, Stefan was mentioning the value of time and the use of the problem with the state preferences. We typically, in case of autonomous vehicle or any innovation that is not present in the market, we do use state preferences, because to use a revealed preference, we need to have a real market in order to ask people what they have done, the real behavior. If the alternative is not in the real market, we cannot ask real people what they have done. So state preference, with all the limitations that correctly Stefan was mentioning, but still in some cases, we need to use them because we have no other method. And in particular, of course, in the case of autonomous vehicle, there is not in the market. So people do not have a preference for a product that is not currently in the market. So they didn't have the time. We build preference when we try the product. So if the product is not there, people do not have the time to build their preference for this innovative product. We carried out a couple of survey, both in UK and in China. And we discovered that the majority of people have heard about autonomous vehicle, but when it comes to how familiar you are, not so many people in reality are familiar. So for example, surprisingly in China, only 90, not surprisingly, in China, only 19% was not familiar at all. But in China, there are also examples of autonomous vehicle working in real working in the city. In some cities, there are trials of autonomous vehicles. So it's more likely that, for example, in China, people are more aware of autonomous vehicle because there are examples operating in the city. Normally, when we build a state choice experiment, because we know that people are not that familiar, we try to present the case before. And this is, of course, really important, but we need to be careful because sometimes we present the environment like everybody's happy, everything is perfect, perfectly clean, etc. So there is, of course, a risk of priming. It means that people are affected by everything that is fantastic. And this, when we ask for the state choice experiment, they might be more positive and choose more autonomous vehicle than they would do in reality. The problem of state preference is, as I said, we use to test alternatives that are not currently available, but the risk of be far from the real, what people is aware of is inversely proportional with the degree of innovation. So the more innovative is the product that we present, the higher is the risk that what we present is not perceived as realistic. So this is why state preference is a great tool to measure this preference, but we know they have limitation. And one of these is precisely the realism. So a work that I'm doing with in a project and also with some PhD students is trying to use virtual reality to measure preferences for autonomous vehicle. Still using kinesthetic preferences, but embedded in a virtual reality environment to see whether a more realistic environment that make feel people as if they were in real world gives different results and hopefully better results. We're not yet to the point to say whether they're really better or not, but definitely to check whether what is the impact of more realism in the results for preferences for autonomous vehicle. So this is an example of the street in Newcastle that we built with a virtual reality experiment. And I don't know if you can see the video here. So this is the virtual reality experiment. So people can see a taxi going around. Some of them have normal taxi with a driver, and some other have nobody inside. So people leave this environment and try to get used to a new environment where autonomous vehicle will be present. So the idea is that they can make the choice leaving the environment as if that was the real world. So, and then they ask, of course, to make a choice about which taxi they would like to take, and they go through a state choice experiment, but within the virtual reality experiment. The project was we could not continue the project during the COVID, unfortunately, because you know that virtual reality you need to have a headset, etc. But we have run lots of pilots. In general, we ask, of course, lots of questions also in terms of how realistic you felt. If you had any problem, for example, sometimes sickness or that's. Most of the people said yes, it felt really, really realistic, and no problem in terms of sickness or anything like that. We also ran the same experiment online, so to try to compare, of course, the results. Preliminary results that we got is that preferences are quite different. And particular for some impact, some attributes, we were measuring something related to the social influence of other people. And this is a very difficult attribute. Lots of colleagues try to measure this attribute with a state choice experiment. We managed, I also tried, but it's one of the attributes that very often is not highly significant. And with the virtual reality experiment, that was highly significant. And again, these are pilots, so I'm not saying like, yes, this is definitely the case, but as a initial results, that was something that we noticed a lot. So probably it seems that there is an impact, there is a difference whether a person lived the experience or we just present with a paper or a grid of values in a screen. So in terms of autonomous vehicles, we found that people sometimes feel that is the human contact is something that is missed. So this is not related to state choice in particular, but to the autonomous vehicle in particular. So we are going towards much more automation in our life. We should not probably forget in our future the importance of human contact. So lots of people lack this human contact. So they would like to have, even if there's no driver, but someone to talk to. So to conclude this short presentation, this is a very challenging topic to study, but it's also very, very fascinating. Definitely we are going to have this innovation. So it's really, really important to know, to try to forecast the adoption of this technology in a better way. But this can also be extended to any other alternative, even the real one, in order to measure or to forecast the demand and to measure individual preferences or value of time or the measure that we want to get from the related to the transport mode or system that we are going to use. So that's all for me. And of course, any question you would like to ask, I'm very happy to answer. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Elisabetta, for your interesting presentation. I'm going to invite our other two presenters just to join us to open the questions and answers section from the audience. And I also have some questions here while you were talking. And I can start with a question to Chiara, and it's about systematic taste variations regarding the gender. If you find some difference in multitasking or regarding if females, for instance, have a different perception of multitasking while traveling than men.
Yes, thanks for the question. I think it's an interesting topic because it's something that we see quite a bit in time use study. And so in our first paper, looking specifically at online activities, we didn't find specific differences, but we did find differences in the study looking at a wider range of activities. So we found, for example, that while traveling, women do more personal care. So, for example, time spent eating or sleeping. They do kind of unsurprisingly more household care. So they are the one escorting the children, taking care, entertaining the children while traveling and so on. And they do it for longer. And they work less while traveling. I think this kind of findings are interesting in terms of, for example, when we talk about accessibility of transport modes, because if we know, for example, that women are the ones that are more, they're generally taking care of the kids while they travel and so on, this has implications for who will benefit more from ramps on trains or from lifts in stations and so on. So yes, we do find differences. And I think I go back to the issue of data. With that data, we could do more interactions, see which modes, which purposes are more strongly associated with these differences.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to move for a question for Estefan. How can these works can be replicated in Latin America? Since we don't have any official time value of time values here, like those that you have in the UK.
You do in some places. There's going to be a study in Chile starting next week. So certainly some countries have value of time work. I mean, look, it's not just relevant in cases where there are official value of times, okay? It's also relevant in cases where there are consulting studies that have computed value of time measures, for example. So the other point is, though, let's not dwell on the question of whether we want to use the GPS results to compare the value of time to official studies from SP studies. It's just the point of the paper and of the presentation is that we can use GPS data to actually compute value of time measures that are reliable. So it's not necessarily, I wouldn't want to see this work as an invitation for lots of other work to try and validate the use of GPS data, but see it more as a case of not ruling out the use of GPS data to start with.
Okay, thanks, Estefan. I will go with the next question that is for all presenters, but we'll start with Elisabetta. The audience asked about the big data, machine learning techniques, and other modern tools that are emerging in transport modeling and analysis. How to combine traditional travel behavior techniques with these new tools? That's a very tough one, I think.
Elisabetta, you go first.
The simple answer is we are studying way to combine them. How there are different methods. So, there's not one single answer to the why. Yeah, that's my quick answer. But I would say that we are still studying a way to combine them. So it's still research. There are results, of course. Someone has already some results, but it's not a technology that is ready, like can be, state preferences for willingness to pay or things like that, where we have years of decades of studies. So that's my quick answer.
Well,
Estefan, do you want to add something?
I would say I think you need to have a very balanced view. So you could say, big data has big problems, which is true. But similarly, you can say, real data has problems, RP data has problems, but they're real problems as opposed to hypothetical problems. So I don't think we should see one of these data sources as being the answer to all of our questions. It's more a case of combining these things, using them for the right purposes, using them in the right way. And, it's the same thing with, I think machine learning has great potential, but I don't think it will replace behavioral models, because at the end of the day, we're still interested in actually understanding the behavior that's at the heart of things. And I think for prediction, there will be limitations to what you can do with machine learning as well.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to move to the next question, and it goes for Chiara. Chiara, the audience, someone from the audience asked about how did you manage to differentiate the activities that were done simultaneously while using the MDC EB model?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because when we're trying to understand multitasking and people doing things at the same time, as I said, it's really hard to capture this. And in the best data we've got, at least the data that we could get our hands on, we have, for example, 10 minutes intervals, and we know that in those 10 minutes interval, people have, let's say, worked and eaten, but we have no idea whether they've worked for 5 minutes and then eaten for 5 minutes, or they've done both at the same time, or whichever other distribution. I think in this area, you can only go so far, because, if you ask me, I have no idea at what point today I've done two things at the same time, and which were these things. So I think we can try to get close. And there are data collection techniques which are extremely intrusive, such as having people wear cameras around their neck. And there you're sure that you're going to capture everything they do, but you're not going to get a representative sample. So I think, in our case, we have small time interval, but we're not sure at the instant level. But if you've got better ideas about how we could collect this data, I'd be happy to talk, because I think it's a big challenge.
Thank you very much. The next go for Stefan, and the audience asking about privacy issues in the data collection and in the GPS data collection and the app, the mobile phone app you use in your study.
Chiara, do you remember? We did this 5 years ago, the data collection.
Yes.
I mean,
in terms of privacy in the GPS, I think so. What we did, we didn't capture the exact home location. We had a 50-meter radius.
Yeah, it's a small cutoff, isn't it?
Yeah, so normally you set a certain circle and you don't know exactly where they go. This is
even so. I mean, I think with any of these data sets, there are concerns, and you're relying on the goodwill of the participants to take part in it. And the most important thing is probably secure storage of the data, and not associating specific people with specific results in your data. But yeah, it's going to be the case that people are tracked. But I think that the people are almost used to being tracked with so many other apps at the moment anyway.
I think, sorry, just to add to that, I think the problem here arises in specific cases. So, for example, if you live in the middle of a countryside and there's only one house in that whole area, then you have a problem, because you can't include that person, because you can identify them. But in most kind of city type of data collection like we did, you don't really have major issues.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to pass to the next question, the next couple of questions for Elisabetta. We have two questions from the same person. I would like to know what is the limit for considering the use of technologies for the presentation of hypothetical scenarios. That's the first one. And the second one is how many variables or elements that are shown in the screen I should think in the experiment should be considered as part of people choice process.
Okay, both very good question. At the moment, of course, the technology cannot be widely used, because you need to have the headsets is like very easy to get, but you need to have the environment, so to build, and that is challenging to, especially if you want to have high level of realism in the environment. But the technology in this area is really developing fast. So it might be that in a couple of years or 10 years, etc., is going to be, everything will be, let's think about Google. 10 years ago, we have never thought we could see in our screen the street from everywhere in the world, from South America to, I mean, if I want to see the street where you are now, I can. And a couple of years ago, that was impossible to think about, and very quickly we get that. So it might be that very soon we will have the 3D environment of almost everything. So it might be, I don't know, but it might be now the limit is the building on the environment, but it might be very easy to have it very quickly, and so also to be able to modify the environment and build a hypothetical scenario that we can test. How many variables? This is a problem with this realism, because basically the more realistic is the environment, the more things people can look at, and the more difficult it is to control what they base their choice on. So this is the challenge of having a more realistic environment. So you need to be careful to control. Something that you can do is that if the environment does not change, and only so you can control the variable that's change among between scenarios that you present, then you might have a control of what the person is based on the choice upon. But it is difficult. You need to be careful of what you show, because everything can have an effect.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are in Cátedra Europa, and to be like more similar to the UK, it start raining. So
it's not raining in Newcastle. I don't know in Leeds, but
no, it's brilliant.
It's also warm today. That's very.
That's good.
So you see, the world is upside down. In Colombia it's raining, and in the UK it's not.
Yeah, that's really weird. But okay, just I'm going to the following question for Chiara. Yeah. Just to give a little bit of context to the Colombian context, and how crowded are buses in your sample? Because this is not the figure of what happened in Latin American countries, for instance. Then multitasking also on buses while traveling a bus is not that easy. Because maybe people are worried about security, or maybe are worried about some other things that and not to perform other activities. So have you think about the implications of your story just translating to other contexts like the Latin American one?
That's a very good point. I think in terms of buses, we find in all the studies that multitasking is least likely on buses among the kind of non-active modes, let's say, because the reason you say, because there's crowding, and they, differently from a train, they're obviously less kind of stable environment. I think it's true that the context makes a huge difference. I still think that the implications for potentially autonomous vehicles, for example, stay in terms of, if we learn what people want to do and can do while they travel, and then we introduce this kind of technology, in different places, those findings might be transferable. But I agree that, that we would definitely need to collect data and see whether this kind of considerations come into it. I would expect to see differences. I don't know specifically the Colombian situation. I know that there's traffic problems. This is what I know. But I don't know, for example, about trains, train travel and so on. So I think actually it would be very interesting to it's how this advances, unfortunately, because the rich countries have the money, have the data. And so we start from here, and then we hope that there's going to be a chance to to, at least we know how to do it. And we hope that there's going to be opportunities in terms of data to apply it elsewhere.
Okay, that's like, I think it's like very in line with the following question from the audience, because someone asked that for all the presenters, that something that is a little curious for him or for her. What have you seen or know about the transportation modeling or or transportation model in Colombia? Because it says it's different, or it's very different from your context. Do you know anything about
Only what you told me, Julian.
Well, I don't know in Colombia, I know in Chile, and I know in Chile before the Transantiago. So I don't know if Colombia is similar to the the Transantiago in Chile or not, sorry.
Yes, some cities are have BRT system, like 7 cities indeed, like Chile, like the Transantiago. I think the most populated ones have BRT systems, but regular buses are similar to what was used to be in Santiago before Transantiago, and it spread all Colombia. The main transportation mode is the bus, and it's quite different. We have no like rail network here in Colombia, and to make interurban trips, so it is not that similar. But but we can learn a lot from your experiences, and trying to transfer results to Colombia, and compared to, and that's, I think, the what is pretty about research and doing like different things in different countries. So I'm going to move to the next question for Stefan. Just a little bit also implication of your studies for countries like Colombia, where maybe SP and RP studies and the SP design is not that strong here in Colombia, and maybe GPS studies, or as you call it, semi-passive data sources, maybe is a good way, or just to accomplish this kind of story to large scale. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I didn't necessarily think the design of the SP surveys matters. I mean, my view about SP design is that it doesn't matter as much as some people think it does, because if you really listen to the expert on SP design, then you would need to know everything about your model before you collect data, in which case, well, then there's no need to go and collect data, because you need to know everything beforehand. I actually think, thinking, if you're, well, look, everyone's got mobile phones now, okay? And it strikes me that this is a good way of collecting data to get large samples, somewhat representative samples, and be able to work with that. And another one of our former students, Andrew Mbale, when I was saying, he was using mobile phone data from Senegal to look at route choice and computing value of time with that as well. So I think there are opportunities there across the world. The other thing that comes into it is with SP studies. I think what's much more of a risk than a poor design is the presentation influencing the answers. So the way someone answers an SP survey is a function of their understanding of the survey, their understanding of how you're answering the questions, and maybe they think they should answer in a certain way. That's why I always tell people there's no right or wrong answer. Whereas if people actually make the journeys, then they make those journeys not because they're trying and somehow make you happy as an interviewer, but they make those journeys for a specific reason, and you're capturing data on that.
Thanks. I have another question for Elisabetta. And this question is, I don't know if you noticed, but from some studies that we have performed here in Colombia, we achieve a larger sample size when using these virtual reality experiments. And that's why, and that was because people were like very interested on just testing and exploring the virtual reality environment. That happened to you in the UK, or is quite different from what we experience here? Because here people was like really excited on participating on the survey, so we were really excited as well, because we can just get to a larger audience, but also we can explore like more complex attributes, like having motion, attributes that have motion, or whatever. So I just want, I mean, just a little bit curious about your experience about that.
Well, in UK, people are less enthusiastic, let's say, to come to the lab and do all the experiment. Of course, I mean, they come, but when you say you had a larger sample, is compared to what? Online survey or?
Yeah, because a typical paper-based survey, if we just launch a paper-based survey, it's like, oh, okay, it's boring. But if we launch a survey, because we did that just to compare the traditional paper-based survey against the virtual reality one, so that's what we observed.
Yeah, no, in my experiences in UK is that definitely online you can get easier, many more answers than with the virtual reality. And the point is also the time, because I mean, if you do online, still it takes 15 minutes, 20 if it is very long, elaborate, blah, blah. If they have to use the virtual reality, they have to come to the lab. So there is the trip for them to come. And then, you know, all the procedure before you start the actual virtual reality to avoid all the surprising effects, to familiarize with the instrument, etc. So there is a process, a protocol that we are trying to follow in order to normalize all possible effects that might then influence the answers. And this takes time. So, of course, I mean, the more you experience, the more you reduce this time. Also for us, I mean, it's new, so we are going through that, but definitely is much longer. So to have big sample is not easy.
Okay, thank you. So I have two last questions, and the first one goes to Chiara. Is about this whole literature, this bunch of literature about the positive value of travel time, and you are talking about multitasking. Then how to combine these other tasks that are performed while traveling, and this this trend that the like the evaluation of travel time is negative. So that's like the question.
Yeah. It's a very good question. I think it's a really hard one, but you know, I think talking about positive value of travel time is a bit of a stretch, in the sense that, you know, you'd rather be at home or at work rather than, you know, as we've all learned, I think, during the pandemic. I think what's interesting to see is whether, I think the most interesting thing here is to understand what the dependent trip duration, because let's say I have to do a trip to uni. If it lasts for 10 minutes, maybe I can't do a lot. But if it lasts for 20, maybe I can start doing something and I can actually complete a task before I get there. So we need to understand, you know, while probably the beta for travel time is still going to be negative, what's the effect of being able to use that time productively when the time of the trip changes? And I think this is something that I don't think there is a lot of literature in this. I think there is something, but I think, yeah, this is where we need to, you know, with better data about multitasking. And I think the difficult thing here is that when we manage to collect this multitasking data, we don't often know a lot about the infrastructure provided in the mode that people were traveling in. So it's really difficult also to advance policy making because we don't know if people were on a bus with very good internet and a comfortable table or not. We just know what they've been doing. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do, but cautiously.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last one goes to Elisabetta. Yeah, and is if you have explored these virtual reality experiments and this virtual reality environment to measure perceptions of the urban environment or like other complex attributes like, for instance, noise or other attributes that are important for transport studies as well?
No, I have not. At the moment, the study is focusing on interaction with autonomous vehicle when people cross streets and choice of mode of transport in terms of taxi. But there are studies actually with virtual reality. In urban studies, they use I'm not sure if it's perception of environment, but definitely for the environment, there are studies on that. There are a few studies, but some of them are in this precise in this field, but I have not. But of course, the noise you can do once you have the environment, then you can also test, the impact of noise or other things. Yeah, but I have not done that.
Okay. So just with this final question and answer, I just want to thank you all for being here, for accepting our invitation. We are very pleased to have you here. Although virtually, we would love to have you here in person, but I think for the next time, we will have you here and enjoy Barranquilla for sure. So thank you very much.
Thanks to you for the
Thanks,
invitation.
Julian.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks.
We would like to thank all the lecturers in the engineering faculty for your participation and all attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education of talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donation button at the homepage at Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay tuned with Cátedra Europa events. Good afternoon.